Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dick Deming. I'm Medical Director of Mercy One Cancer Center and founder of Above and Beyond Cancer. Welcome to our Cancer Education Series, which is funded in part with a grant from the Iowa Cancer Consortium. And you're in for a treat tonight. I'm in for a treat tonight because I have a good friend of mine with us, Yasmina Madden. Yasmina is Associate Professor of English at Drake University. Yasmina grew up in Illinois and got her Bachelor's of Arts at Loyola Marymount in Los Angeles, and then her Master's of Fine Arts in Fiction at Indiana University, and has been on the faculty at Drake for about 10 years.
Yeah.
And Yasmina and I first met because Yasmina helped our cancer survivors that were going on some of our journeys to do some creative nonfiction, some writing, to sort of reflect on their experiences, their cancer experiences, but also their experiences. So the title of tonight is Reflective Writing. So what does reflective writing mean to you, that term?
I think of it as reflective writing. I often use the term expressive writing. I think it is just a kind of narrative that is invested in exploring the self, right? That puts the self first. You are, of course, locating yourself in a larger context, right? Where do I stand in the world? How do I make sense of the world around me? And you narrow the scope quite a bit, right? So you might be thinking about a very particular experience. So with the survivors and caregivers who have gone on these trips you mentioned, they might be writing about anything from the actual trip, the physicality of the actual trip, or they might be writing about something that happened to them long before the trip, right? That maybe the trip has evoked, and they've gone back to an experience from childhood, or they've become interested in reflecting on faith, for instance. So, I think reflective writing is a really broad term, but I would think of it as first and foremost an investigation of self and emotion.
So sort of self-reflection. So
yes.
And maybe to help put things in context. So there's diary writing, there's journaling.
Right.
There is maybe just taking notes.
Sure.
And then there is the process where after you've gone through something, you sit down and try to make something bigger of it.
Sure.
So I just think of, I think our first trip together was to the summit of Kilimanjaro. Is that right?
I worked with Kilimanjaro folks, but it was Nepal in 2012.
Okay.
So Imjase.
Go to Imjase together. Yes, which was a 3-week trip. And even if you wanted to, it would be difficult with the physical demands to actually sit down and compose several pages of coherent. So a lot of what happens on the trip is journaling and taking notes and making almost a bit of a diary to help remember some of the not
a
just
record
what
of details.
Details of what you're seeing, but also what you might be thinking along the way, because there's time as you're hiking up the mountain where you're experiencing the mountain, and even though we try to be here now, you might be having a conversation with someone that brings in memories of a different time and place.
Absolutely. So I think, in terms of that umbrella of narrative nonfiction or expressive writing or self-reflective writing, you're absolutely right. We can think about it in terms of journaling, which I think is the most accessible way to think about it for beginning writers. Would be probably everyone at some point in their lives has jotted down something in a journal, right? If they haven't formally written in a journal, right, they have perhaps written a letter or even just written down ideas or an experience because they're trying to make sense of it, right? I know I've done that just to figure out how I feel about a situation or an occurrence in my own life. I think that as we formalize the writing a little bit, we're moving into the genre of personal essay or narrative nonfiction, right? So this is what you're talking about with the longer form, where you begin to, I think the biggest difference there is you begin to, of course, think about yourself, reflect on the experience, what it means to you, what it meant to you then versus now when you're composing the essay. The biggest difference, though, of course, from journaling would be the audience changes, right? So you are not just writing for yourself. You're doing that, absolutely. You're still writing for yourself. I would say, I mean, if you think of the personal essay, the term comes from essayer, which is French for to try or to make a run at something. And
Was that Montaigne?
yes, very good. You're a very good student, Dr. Deming. Yes, so Montaigne, who is sort of the grandfather of
the essay.
Yes, the essay, thought of it as very experimental. It was an attempt to make a run at something, whatever that thing is that you're trying to surround or understand about yourself and the world around you. So when we get into that more formal essay writing, you have to start thinking about audience, right? How does this come across to someone else, right? This isn't just for me anymore. It started as something for me. It's become something else. So that changes things quite a bit.
Before we get into that, and I do want to get into that, let's get back to journaling. So, there's a lot has been written. There's been studies done that the healing benefit of journaling, the therapeutic benefit of journaling. And I think back in Wallace Stegner novel, All the Little Life Things, there's a line, something like, how do I know what I think until I see what I write? And that the act of writing something, I mean, we can perseverate in our mind and think we've got these grand ideas, but actually committing something to paper is a commitment to an idea that you have to really be coherent about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's intentional, right?
Yes.
I mean, it takes intention.
And maybe share a little bit about, because your knowledge of how just journaling or other reflective writing, not for an audience, but just the act of putting something down on paper, how that creativity and that reflection can be of therapeutic benefit or have healing power.
Sure. So, I mean, journaling is such a powerful tool. And I think it's pretty self-evident that if you are going to write in a journal, there are going to be emotional benefits, right? So if you've ever written in a journal, you maybe have experienced just relief after writing about maybe a difficult moment in your day, or you've experienced gratitude. A lot of people write gratitude journals, right? So they record something from each day that they're grateful for and they reflect on that, right? And they might experience joy as they reflect and write about that. So I think it's quite self-evident that there would be emotional benefits to journaling, and there would be mental clarity that you might achieve when you are able to, as you said, like intentionally write down something that has, happened at work or something that happened with your child or your partner, or whatever it might be that you're trying to make sense of, right? What I think most people or many people are not aware of are the other benefits that come with self-reflective writing, with expressive writing, and that these can go beyond the emotional. They can go beyond just emotional relief or mental clarity. You'll get those things. What I started to realize when I started to do a little bit more research about expressive writing, as I became more interested in what it had to do with physiological health, is that I began to come across research primarily from a social scientist named James Pennebaker, who in many ways was one of the founders of what we think of as, some people would call it therapeutic writing. I still prefer self-reflective and expressive. He calls it therapeutic because he conducted a lot of studies starting in the 1980s, looking at what happened when folks were asked to write for about 3 to 4 days in a row for only 15 minutes each time. And he had college students These were his guinea pigs in the first study. He had college students who he asked to write about a difficult experience. For some, he even used the word like a traumatic experience, something difficult or traumatic you've experienced in your life. I want you to write about that for me for 15 minutes. No one's going to see this. This was all part of the experiment. No one will see it. It's anonymous. These students had no idea why they were doing this. So he asked them to write about a difficult experience and to include details of that experience, but also to write about how it made them feel, how it made them feel then, how it made them feel as they were writing about it. So they were reflecting as they were writing the details of the event. And then he had his control group write about the details of the classroom they were sitting in, just the details. This table, this microphone, notes, a pencil, glasses, the light is bright, those kinds of things, right? And what the students didn't know is what Pennebaker was tracking were their physiological responses post writing session. So after he conducted this first experiment, which was a total of 4 days, 15 minutes of writing, many of the students who were asked to write about the emotional, traumatic, self-reflect, difficult experience, I should say, right away reported enjoying the writing, saying they would do it again, even if they didn't have to. They would choose to go through it again because they felt good after they wrote. They felt like they had a little more clarity about the situation. So they were reporting, I think, what we would expect, right? Emotional relief, maybe some mental clarity. What they didn't know is they were asked to participate in tracking at the Student Health Center for the rest of the semester. And essentially what Pennebaker found out was that there were these students who wrote the self-reflective expressive writing had fewer trips to the Student Health Center. They had better immune functioning. It was reported that their blood pressure was lower. So there were actual real physiological benefits. And they were sick less often, like colds and flu and that sort of thing, versus the control group who was only recording just details, right?
And we've talked about other experiences where something can actually change one's physiology. And we've talked about, when you, let's say you're going outside at night to take a bag to the garbage can and a dog jumps out at you, and you feel physiology happen. The dog doesn't touch you, but that thing out there affects your emotions and the physiology. The same power can happen in the opposite direction, but it's usually more subtle with listening to music, or enjoying art, or someone's company. Those positive changes that happen on our physiology aren't as startling, so we don't recognize them necessarily where they're happening, but they can change our anatomy, our physiology, our chemistry, our immunology, and have this positive effect.
Yeah, and I was thinking of music too. I mean, I think anyone who enjoys music has probably felt that, when you're listening to something, you feel that a kind of release or calmness. And this person, Pennebaker, this wasn't one study. He's done, many studies across a lot of different populations, not just college students who, tend to get sick a lot and, are burning the midnight oil. So, since the 1980s, there have been a lot of other studies with different populations that have produced the same results, that higher immune functioning, lower blood pressure, fewer visits to the doctor, lower incidence of absenteeism at work even. So, I found that when I started to read about expressive writing and physiological benefits, this was a really big surprise to me.
So when we first got together and you talked to our group of cancer survivors and caregivers that was going to go that went to Nepal on the 3-week trip where we summited a 20,000-foot peak. And as I recall, we talked a bit about the healing benefits of journaling, but we also talked about our goal was that when we were all done to have each individual who wanted to work on a piece afterwards that we would bring together and publish. And I remember distinctly the talk you gave before we went to sort of prepare us. And as you were talking about what makes a good piece of creative nonfiction or something that you write afterwards that's intended for an external audience, that bringing sensory details into your writing were really going to be important. And it really, I still remember to this day, changing the way in which I went about that trip, as I am for days hiking, thinking about, okay, pay attention not only to what I'm seeing, but pay attention to what I'm hearing, pay attention to what I'm smelling, to what I'm tasting, to what I'm feeling, with the idea that I'm going to want to draw on these sensations when I get ready to sit down and write. And it actually changed the way in which I traveled on the trip.
Yeah. I mean, it's so important, and especially for writing that is going to go beyond your journal, right? I think even with journaling, investing in that, in the bodily is really important. Even if it's just for yourself, it becomes even that much more important if you're going to ask someone else to read this, or you're going to share it with family. Or many people from the trip shared their narratives with their workplaces or with their places of worship. And so they had bigger audiences, fundraisers. Jeff Lawrence shared this beautiful narrative he wrote at Drake at a fundraiser. So when you have a big audience, right, even the audience of one, this isn't going to hurt, right? Because it's going to allow you to experience what it is that you're trying to understand, right, or discover that much more vividly. So even at the journal level, I would say it's important to think about the five senses and what did it feel like when, I began the journey to Nepal and I was on an airplane with 25 people I didn't know, and we were going to climb a 20,000 foot some mountain, right? What did that seem like? What did it sound like? The chatter on the airplane, all of those things that helps to sort of recreate the experience for yourself, right? That becomes absolutely necessary if you're going to read your piece to an audience, right? Or share your story with family. And I mean, there's the old adage is show instead of tell, right? If you are going to share a narrative, how can you show someone who hasn't had your experience what it looked like, what it felt like, what it smelled like, what it tasted like, right? What it sounded like? How do you show them those things? You show them those things through sensory detail, right? The things we can reach out and touch, the things we can hear, the things we can taste. And it becomes vivid and it becomes real to your reader, right? Because if you're going to share a story, what's your main goal as a writer? It's to hook someone with that narrative, right? It's to draw someone in.
And we knew this was going to be incredible. I mean, going halfway around the world, sights and sounds and smells and tastes and sensations. The purpose of bringing you on was not to turn people into professional writers. And in fact, we were going with this common bond of cancer. And I think that there was no requirement that anybody write anything, and there was no requirement that what you wrote had to reflect on your cancer journey. But the whole coming together of a group of individuals that have gone through this cancer journey, many who use the metaphor of climbing a mountain to be a metaphor for their cancer journey. And now we're climbing a mountain, but together with this sort of group reflection on what was it. What role did cancer play in your life? And it obviously brought all of us together in the room. So maybe have you reflect a little bit on your own um, experience and how you've been touched by cancer in your
Sure.
family, and whether you approached the coaching of journaling and eventually creative nonfiction writing with any sort of different philosophical or psychological, or with any expectations about what was to come from that writing.
Sure. In terms of my own connection, it would be that I had my older brother was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia when he was in his mid 30s, and I actually took a leave of absence from Drake. He had recently gotten married, and his wife was an attorney, and they needed that really great insurance, that sort of thing. And so I went just to kind of advocate and help out. I was able to do that thanks to Drake. And so that was sort of my connection to cancer. I think after I spent about 6 months going back and forth from Des Moines to Chicago and helping him out. And it did feel like a full-time job, as I'm sure many people who have had cancer, or many people who have cared for those who have cancer, know advocating for your loved one can become a full-time job. And it really did feel like one. Just making sure that he had everything that he needed, that he was getting the best care possible, that we understood what was happening. It was complicated and it took a lot of time. So I was very lucky to be able to do that, to be able to spend that time with him.
Just an aside, did you or your brother journal during that experience?
So my brother is one of the most stoic, like least expressive, like everything's fine, I'm good. Like, I mean, he was really sick and it was still like, oh, it's all good, I'm fine. But, and I know you've heard this story before, but it really is, I mean, it almost seems to fit too perfectly into the conversation, but I swear it's true. He had a great team at Northwestern University in Chicago, but there was one incident before we found that team that really sort of reiterated to me the power of writing, especially when someone is going through something as difficult as a really serious cancer diagnosis. And so I'll try not to make it too long. Essentially what happened was he was working with a doctor who, after we were able to have a second opinion, we realized was giving him kind of a very questionable path to take that involved certain studies at the university. It just seemed a little bit odd. And it's okay because we found a better team and everything turned out okay. My brother was doing great. But what happened when he realized, after talking to another team, that there was a much better option for him, was that he was really angry. And he was really confused and he was really nervous because he felt like, oh my gosh, for so long I've been thinking I was going to do A, and now I'm hearing that that's really not in my best interest. What was going on with this doctor? Why did she tell me these things? And he was so upset. And my skills really are academic. And so he was pacing the room. He was so upset. He was so angry. And I just thought, oh God, how can I help him? What is it? What can I do right now? He rarely gets upset. He does not get angry. I whipped out my laptop and I said, okay, why don't we write down what it is that you want to tell your doctor? What do you want to tell her? Let's just write it down. Like, don't worry, we don't have to send it, but let's just write it down. And I swear to you, we sat there for a couple of hours and he paced and he talked at me and I just quietly recorded what he was saying. And then together we went through it and edited it until it was a letter, a very well-written letter, I would add. And afterwards, my brother said he was so much calmer. And he said, don't do anything with it right now. Just save it on your laptop. So I still have that letter and we never sent it. But what it did was it gave my brother so much clarity to write down, here are my options. Here's what I want to know. Why did you tell me X, Y, and Z? And in doing that, right, there was such a relief that came with getting down how he felt, that he was angry, that he felt she had failed him. All of these things he got out on paper into this letter. and moved on without ever sending the letter. And I thought, wow, that's something. There's something there. Yeah, there's something there. I mean, it really was therapeutic for him. And so I didn't know what to do with that. I mean, I teach narrative nonfiction and fiction, but that's really different than working with survivors and caregivers. Those are two different things, right? Working with 18 to 22-year-olds, most of whom have not been ill seriously in their lives, and then working with a whole other population. So when I got back to Des Moines, someone mentioned Above and Beyond Cancer, and that's kind of how I fell in with you.
And so then when we came in and you met the group and gave this very room a talk about journaling and about creative nonfiction and about writing, and then you set off on the journey with them. And for those who may not know, I mean, basically it's a 3-week trip. About 2 weeks of it is hiking, climbing to 20,000 feet. There is a lack of oxygen. There's lots of physical exertion. It's about 100 miles of walking and climbing. And what would you maybe just reflect a little bit on that journey, your own experience physically, and then what were you doing in terms of journaling or writing while those 2 weeks of intense physical activity was going on?
Well, so I've actually had the great opportunity of going on 3 journeys with you guys now. So they're all kind of blending in my mind because, there've been several of them, but I would say that when I think of stories and narrative and I think of these trips, more than anything, I mean, the writing happens, right? But most of it's happening afterwards when we're doing the longer composed pieces. I was writing in fits and bursts, pretty much like the rest of the team. When I had the energy.
Just out of curiosity, do you use a bound journal? Do you use a moleskin?
I love a moleskin. I love
and
a
do you
small
like
moleskin.
The little one?
I do.
Okay.
I like the little
And are
ones.
you mostly jotting down just words and little phrases as opposed to sentences?
I would say that a lot of times sentences, a lot of interest in image. So imagery, like a line about something I see or something I touched, right? The feel of like a leaf, the dust, that we pulled those buffs up to sort of protect ourselves from, what it felt like tickling up my nose, those kinds of just little bits and pieces. Sometimes at night, if I had more energy, I would do something a little bit more narrative. But again, I was working in the little moleskin that I could tuck into my North Face pocket, like tiny pocket right here, and have access to. And maybe in the evening, I would talk a little bit more about like where we were in the journey, some of the details, just so I could remember it when I got home of what point in the journey we were on, who I walked with that day, what that person maybe talked to me about. So, I'm actually thinking of the most recent trip that we all took to Tibet and Mount Kailash. And one of the most incredible parts of that trip was actually not summiting or not circumambulating. We didn't summit, that's illegal. We did not do that. It was actually after we had done the official flag ceremony and we were sort of on the tail end of the trip, and there was a really long walk, and I walked with a woman named Vicky Bott, and we walked for about 8 hours after getting up at like 3 a.m. And having like a very long day. And we talked nonstop for 8 hours. And she told me the entire story of her husband, Joel, I believe his name is Joe Bott, and who had a brain tumor, and about her experience caring for him, caring for her young children while he was ill, what the trip meant to her, and just listening to her story. So when I think of these trips, even before we get to the fancy writing part, it's so much about stories and hearing people's stories and sharing stories. I mean, there's a lot of trekking. And during that time, if, we're not listening to music, we're talking and you're sharing your story and you're hearing other people's stories, and is hands down the best part of those trips to me. Is getting to know each other.
I would agree with you that I commented on trying to pay attention to all the senses, but I kind of am more into the psychology, philosophy, the intellectual, the what's going on with the people that I'm with. I'm certainly aware of the splendor, the beauty,
Sure.
the pain, the suffering, the crunch of snow beneath my boot, all of that. But what keeps me going back is the stories and the interactions.
Right.
And as you learn these very poignant details of everyone's journey, and that tends to be what I focus on in my writing.
Sure.
Bring in the sensory details, but it's when I look back on what I write, it's more about the individuals I'm walking with and the story, what I'm learning about them, and how the suffering we're experiencing on the journey is recapitulated in the suffering of individuals as they've been, both the joy and the sorrow.
Right. And a lot of that conversation was joyful. A lot of what Vicki told me was about Joe's life, not just his illness, what he was like as a father and a husband. It was, probably one of the best conversations I've ever had in my life. Also because we had 8 hours, so we got pretty deep. The conversation went pretty deep.
After the journeys are over, individuals are invited to work with you to turn their notes and journaling into a essay or a piece that would be intended for others to read.
Sure.
So not just for your own self, not just Dear Diary that you keep and pull out, but that to turn it into a piece that would be intentionally meant for somebody else to read.
Yes.
In fact, the idea was to bring these pieces together in a publication that we would share with others. Talk a little bit about what that experience was like, both from your perspective and how you saw the individuals you were working with come to life, or how they took on that project.
Sure. As a teacher, it was incredible to see people embrace writing as a way to make sense of their experiences, whether as survivors or caregivers, or about an experience that really had nothing to do with their health, but had been sort of brought to the surface maybe by the trip. So for me as a teacher, it was incredible because I've never sort of taught in that context before. It was new for me. And one of the things that I loved about the project is I felt as if people understood they could come to it sharing what they wanted to share. I had a writer who wrote a recipe on yak milk tea, and sort of a poem recipe was the form, because that is how she chose to sort of express herself, and what she was so taken with on the trip, and what she wanted to write about was the hospitality of the Sherpa people. And so that's what she focused on. And it was very short, and it was very beautiful, and it was rooted in sensory experience, the preparation of the tea, the smell of it, the lodge she was in, the home she was in when she first tasted it, the warmth of it, and all of the sort of metaphor for that warmth of the Sherpa people. So there's this beautiful short piece. And then I worked with someone who was on the trip to Peru, Laurel, I'm sure you remember, who really jumped into a long narrative that ended up being about her reconnection with Judaism, with the Jewish culture. So this was something that happened to her on the trip, right? So she's a survivor, but she didn't write about her cancer experience. What she wrote about was going on this trip to Peru and meeting a woman named Amy from California, who is also Jewish, and this connection they had when on a coffee plantation, they were celebrating one of the high holidays. It was,
I think Yom Kippur.
Was it Yom Kippur?
But I'm not positive.
I'm not positive either. It was a high holy holiday, and they found candles using Peruvian beer bottles. The guides helped find candles. They got a version of bread that stood in for the challah bread, and they said a prayer before dinner that night. And so Amy, who was very connected to her culture and her faith, kind of sparked that for Laurel, who had stepped away from both the faith and sort of her cultural heritage. You know, she hadn't renounced it by any means, but she wasn't involved in her synagogue. And she came home from that trip and had, she was transformed. And the trip transformed her in terms of her connection to her Jewish faith and culture. So her narrative was something that she shared with her synagogue once she had reconnected with them. And I mean, talk about having an effect on your audience. After she shared this with her synagogue, one of the members of the synagogue, who's a musician, was so inspired by her narrative that he wrote a musical piece inspired by her story. So she went on this journey, was inspired to write a narrative nonfiction piece
South America.
To South America, reclaimed her Jewish, faith and culture, and then also engendered this musical piece, right, based on her experience. So and it was a beautiful essay. I can understand why it had that effect on someone who was in the audience. It was beautifully written. It was steeped in sensory detail. I mean, I was on the trip, but if I hadn't been, I would have been taken there by her writing. Mm-hmm. So I mean, the writing that happens afterwards can be very short and more informal. It might be a poem. It might be sort of a snapshot of one moment on the trip. And it might be a much longer form, more formal personal narrative, and everything in between. And I think what I saw from people who got very invested in the workshop was a lot of joy more than anything. A lot of pain too while they were writing, because writing's hard, right? But more than anything, joy and discovery, and a desire to share their stories.
How would you say the working with cancer patients, cancer survivors, and the 3 trips that you've been on that have been to other parts of the world that have included physical challenge and adversity and some suffering, but a lot of coming together and communion. How has that in any way changed the way that you write, or affected what you write about, or in any way has changed your life?
Sure. I would say in terms of my own writing, because I teach a lot of narrative nonfiction, it's made me a better teacher to my students at Drake. I also think it's made me a more honest writer. Even though I primarily write fiction, which is just a bunch of lies, really, I would say I am a more honest writer. I try to be more honest in the story that I'm telling, if that makes any kind of sense. Write narrative nonfiction, but I tend to write a lot more fiction. Mm-hmm. But because I see not just what my students do, I mean, the way my students who are 18, 19 years old will put themselves out there in their narrative nonfiction is mind-blowing. Every semester, they blow my minds. They write about very personal experiences with so much maturity and grace. Like, it's hard not to be inspired by them, but also to see caregivers and survivors who have been through so much, who then go on this trip that is so physically demanding and then come home and take on this intellectual challenge, this emotional challenge. It really is inspiring. So, I mean, I think if anything, I've been inspired by the people that I've written alongside, or who I've, guided through workshop. It's just been an inspiration. And I do think it's made me a little bit more honest. I'm a little bit more willing to put myself out there on the page.
So on the 3 international journeys that you've been on, you probably have met at least 70 people.
Sure.
So have they become characters in your novels?
Of course not.
Any of them?
Gosh.
And obviously not
I mean,
wholly, but
just you, Dr. Deming. But you've got a completely different name and characteristics.
Okay.
I would say that I think it would probably be more that certain experiences or conversations that I've had with people, tidbits from those have shown up. Not so much taking a person. I pretty much only use family for that. Yeah. So, but certainly experiences and conversations have definitely been the seeds that then become something else when I'm writing.
So you've talked about several people individually. You talked about Vicky. You talked about Laurel. As you think back on the journeys and the individuals you've worked with, others that have come to mind. So I kind of, for the last couple months, Justin has been on my mind. So we've shared that Justin was on many journeys and was just 26 when he was diagnosed with his cancer, and was, cancer free for 10 years, and came back and died at age 38 just on March 3rd. And Justin was a lead singer in a rock band in Mason City and a waiter at Buffalo Wild Wings when we first met him. But he not only wrote music, both music and lyrics, but he then turned to, writing blogs. And had great emotional honesty in what he wrote.
Wow.
And we chatted a little bit about your working with him. Maybe reflect a little bit about your remembering when you first working with Justin, and any influence you might have had on him or influence he had on you.
I would say he probably had more influence on me, just in that he had such an openness to him. He, in many ways, was like a kid in a candy store, no matter where you took him. Like, it was great, and he was so energetic, so open. He really seemed, and I mean this in a good way, to lack self-consciousness. Like, he was himself no matter where he was, and unabashedly so. And I mean, he was a really great guy and a really, really good writer. So I actually worked with Justin. The first narrative I worked with him on was on a trip I didn't go to. It was the first Kilimanjaro trip that he went on. No, or
2017 was his first Kili trip.
Okay, then it was the first trip to
Everest Base Camp.
Yes, the very first trip of Above and Beyond Cancer.
2011.
Yes, and he, it didn't surprise me that he was a songwriter, because oftentimes with songwriting, like poetry, there is a big investment in detail, imagery, the sensory, right? And so that showed up in his writing immediately. And he had a very strong writerly voice, which that didn't surprise me, because Justin was extra. Like, he was, big. He was a big personality, and he had a strong narrative voice, and that was not a surprise to me at all. One of the things that I appreciated so much about his writing, and I would say this is kind of an influence, is how honest he was in his writing, about being afraid and being angry, but also finding joy during all of those years where, he was many times sort of living on the edge, I guess is the way I would think of it, with his diagnosis and some of the recurrence of his brain cancer. And he was a great storyteller. I mean, I think, and he brought that out in others. I mean, I'm even thinking of the memorial service that was at the, I'm forgetting the name of it, but
Surf Ballroom.
The Surf Ballroom, right?
Yes.
I just, it was typical Justin, bringing a lot of people together who had a story about him, right? Something he did or something he said or a joke, he made, or the way he, brought a guitar halfway around the world so he could entertain people.
You talk about it as emotional honesty. So
Yeah.
you may not know this, but on this very cancer education series, 4 days before he died, he was my guest.
Yes.
And he, I think, truly had a premonition of what was happening, and to a greater extent than even as a doctor I had of him. And we were still talking about him going with us to Wyoming this year. And I remember when I said that to him, he said, "Oh, Doc, you don't think I'm going to be alive in June, do you?" I said, "I do, Justin." And as we were having that conversation that night about the role of music in his life and the role that music influenced his journey and the role that cancer influenced his music, etc., he was kind of wallowing in the dark side for a bit. And I remember just that even as he's contemplating what he knew was coming sooner than I thought, he was very articulate, but just emotionally honest.
Very, very. Another thing I think about when I think of Justin's writing is that he was particularly adept at using humor in his nonfiction, but never in a way that was gratuitous or unnecessary. It always did something for the narrative, which is really, really hard to do. So, I mean, just like as a writer, I always found that very impressive that, he had a very wry, sometimes dark sense of humor. But it was the way he, I think, navigated the world, but it was also a big part of how he navigated his writing.
His last blog entry was about dying and being buried, and there's a part about the worms eating you, and even if you're a vegetarian, the worms will eat you. Isn't that ironic?
Yes.
That as a vegetarian, you're getting eaten by another animal.
Yes, there's a lot of dark humor and humor in that last post, and I imagine it's probably still accessible, but those blog posts were they were very well written and really worth looking at.
Take a hike, Justin.
Yes.
So you just Google "take a hike, Justin," and you'll
really, really great narrative.
Other memories of other individuals that were noteworthy that you're working with them?
So many. So there are so many people. I think of Jeff Lawrence, because he is this big burly dude. I mean, he is like he looks like the definition of like alpha male. If you look up alpha male in the dictionary, and yet he is he is very soft and gentle. And he wrote the most amazing narrative about his diagnosis of cancer, and talked a lot about what it was like to not be seen as kind of a Superman, was the word that he used by his own family. Like he had, been a big brother. He was a father of 2 young girls when he was first diagnosed, a husband, and he was sort of the leader of his family. And he talked a lot in his narrative about what it was like to be ill and to sort of embrace that he wasn't in that position, what it meant to him, what it meant to his family. So he certainly stands out, and just such a generous person. He's done a lot of stuff for Drake and volunteered for things, just really gives back to the community. I think of Judy Allen, of course, because she was just incredible, one of the most brilliant people I know. So Judy was a philosophy and religion professor at Drake, and went on the 2012 trip to Nepal and was a breast cancer survivor. She had BRCA, right? And succumbed to
and then about a year after we got back,
right,
her cancer recurred.
Yes.
And went through her own journey with the end of life, and bringing in, and not only just remembering her, she grew up here in the Midwest, but
Mhm.
had turned to
Right.
Buddhism.
Right.
And part of she led us in Qigong
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
beautiful meditations while we were on the
Yes.
journey and up in the mountains with the Buddhist
Mhm.
monks and priests, and then having had the honor to walk with her on her journey
And
through the end of life.
yeah, I mean, just an incredible person. And she wrote a narrative that was just unbelievable, and it had a lot of elements of Buddhism in it, and prayers, and very much focused on walking.
And walking.
Yes, on walking and the meditation of walking. She was my roommate when we were in Nepal, and I already knew her from Drake, but I just got to know her in a really different way, and I think of her often. That's someone who also stands out.
So then I also had the honor of working with you and with Drake professors and Drake undergrads as we wrote the book Above and Beyond Cancer, which was sort of my thought was I was writing this book about the philosophical journey through cancer, but then as we brought in the students went through all of the writings and interviewed patients and snippets of the cancer survivors reflection of not only going through their cancer journey, but the journeys and then the photos that came together. So all of that. So your teaching and coaching of all of our patients and survivors ended up coming full circle back into the book.
It's a beautiful book, and so many amazing photographs too.
Let's open it up. We've got a live studio audience here, and we also have folks that are watching us live stream. So we'll open it up. And the topic is basically the role writing may play, journaling or writing in your cancer journey or in health and wellness and well-being. Hi, Angelina.
Yes, I do agree that writing does work. When my dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, at the job I was in Arizona, they had that offer for counseling for free. So I'm sitting there. This is my first counseling, and she goes, "You seem really angry, and it's understandable. You go through stages of trying to understand that someone you love has got cancer." And are you angry with God? Or you go, no, I'm strong in my faith. And she goes, well, who are you angry at? Cancer. But you can't hit it. You can't do anything. You can't see it. And I don't know how. And she goes, write a letter to it. And I went, okay. I thought she was crazy. I'm like, and for a day or two, I was kind of like, and then finally I got the paper out and I just wrote a letter. And I read it to my dad, who was in the hospital, and you could see the tears coming down. And so my mom asked me to read it at the funeral. Well, of course, she asked me to clean it up a little because I really was expressive. And everyone says, oh, you were too kind to the cancer. No, I wasn't. Mom made me change it. But then when I got diagnosed with cancer, I grew up with a family of musicians. And mine turned into more of a lyric. I don't have the melody, but I have the lyrics to it and how cancer came at my doorstep.
Wow.
And it went to all my other families and then it came to my doorstep. And so I can't remember the course, but it's, it was that first thing that I had to write down.
Sure.
And then I did the journaling. So it does help because it's in your head, but it helps to put it on paper.
Absolutely.
And it just brings a different meaning to it. And
how amazing that you got to share that letter with your father too, because you said he was crying. Obviously it must have meant a lot.
Oh yeah.
To hear
I told that cancer off and I said, you may have my father's body, but you don't have his soul, his spirit. And that's when he started having the tears. And it's true. Cancer can be this evil darkness that you see or feel, but it's never going to take the essence of who you really are. Right. So, but thank you for telling me that. That verifies that writing does do wonders.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
Anybody?
This is from a viewer on Facebook, Doc. Diane says, journaling provides me a valued therapy that keeps my emotions from pushing me into a little ball of fear.
Yes, I would say that is certainly one of the benefits, right? That it becomes a place. Dr. Deming was saying earlier, like when you have to face something on the page, it's different than just thinking it through. So it makes sense that Diane would say that it keeps her from becoming a ball of fear because, I think part of that process of writing it out is facing that fear, right? Getting it out on the page so that, you're not paralyzed by whatever it is that's scaring you. That's great to hear.
Any other questions or comments?
I find that writing, whatever the experience, whether it be deep sorrow,
Mhm.
or whether it be joy, or whatever, it just makes it so much richer
Mhm.
and deeper. Did nothing go through?
Sorry, we just turned the microphone on. Yeah, please start over again. Thanks, Judy.
Anyway, whatever the experience, whether it be sorrow or whether it be joy,
Mhm.
it makes it so much deeper and soulful.
Mhm.
And it also, as you go through life, a lot of the similar emotions will come into being
Yes.
in life. And it's kind of like a reference point, and it just adds a lot of comfort, to life's experiences and a lot of joy.
Yes.
Even in sorrow, there's joy.
Yes.
A lot of joy.
Yeah, I think that word hasn't come up yet, but comfort. You're absolutely right that it brings so many people not just relief or clarity, but comfort or contentedness.
Yeah.
Right, a kind of peace.
Yeah, I didn't write at all when I had cancer, but I write all the time, about
Nice.
other things.
And is it journaling mostly that you do
Oh yeah.
with your writing now?
Oh
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
a lot.
Great.
I think the other thing that it does is it provides meaning. So as we reflect, well, speaking personally, you ascribe a meaning to it, and sort of we can face things more squarely and reflect on them with less fear and just ambiguity when we sort of realize a meaning and purpose that comes out of our experience.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, all reflective writing, I mean, as soon as we put something on the page, we are looking back on that experience, right? It's all retrospective. Even if it's an experience that we had 3 days ago, it's still, you're coming at it from a different place. So I think one of the things I find so effective about expressive writing or self-reflective writing is that you might be trying to understand or come to terms with or even celebrate. I mean, it might not be something difficult, it might be something joyful, but because you are writing from it from a different point in time, right? You could be writing about something that happened to you 10 years ago or 10 days ago. Your perspective has shifted. So I think it can be a really great way to understand yourself at a different point in time, right? So that, when something like my brother's illness happened, I felt a really particular way while it was happening. I felt very differently a year later when I was writing about it or talking about it. And now he's 10 years out from being very ill, and I still think about it all of the time, but my relationship to that experience has changed so much, right? So I think that the retrospective aspect of self-reflective writing is pretty key to why I think it brings a lot of comfort and discovery for people.
Well, Yasmina, I just want to thank you again for all you have done to help bring out the writing that has come out of all of the cancer patients that you've worked with, and the way that it has improved their lives, and in the process created a body of work that lives on forever.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
the
you.
opportunity.
And thank all of you for attending. If this conversation tonight is something that you think someone would enjoy and find value in, I want to let you know that starting tomorrow, you can watch a repeat of this show on demand on the Above and Beyond Cancer YouTube channel or the Mercy One Cancer Center website. And I hope you'll join us again next week. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. We didn't have time